Hello everyone, I'm George from Ireland. So this video is about President Trump's personality as revealed by his niece's recent book. Now, I haven't been able to read the book. I've read some extensive reviews of it, and there are a lot of them online, some of them very lengthy ones. Anyway, well, one of the things about Trump is he has proved that ignorance is power. It used to be that knowledge is power, because he's an ignoramus himself, and he appeals to the uninformed and the unanalytical, and he's been able to make a career out of that, billions out of that, and indeed become president. His constant bloviation, his grandiosity, and his craving of kudos, well, he's got it, the highest bauble around. Anyway, this book, Too Much and Not Enough, is the title, quoting from memory, is from no mean source. Mary Trump, his niece, who's got a PhD in clinical psychology, and she'd need one. Now, psychologists and psychiatrists often go into it to figure themselves out and their dysfunctional families. And so she's pulled no punches. I don't think from the quotations I've seen, she's been quite dispassionate about this, but she's been able to observe his behaviour very closely for decades, and has got obviously plenty of documentation to prove a lot of what she's saying is true about tax evasion. How on earth has he not been jailed years ago for multi-million-dollar tax evasion on many occasions? But so much of what she said is corroborated by just about everyone who's not a fanatical Trumpist, who's had much to do with him. Tony Schwartz, who wrote that book, The Art of the Deal, which Trump has probably never even opened, and so many of his staffers and so on, colleagues, business partners, lawyers. So it's really unsurprising, the content of this book. And noticeably, there's been no proper refutation from the Trump administration. Oh, it's full of falsehoods. Okay, which ones? Tell me one false statement. They've not pointed out a single bogus statement in the entire book, so they haven't corrected anything. So that's it, just this blanket say, oh, pack of lies. So if it was really a Farragut falsehoods, they would have cited many. Anyway, so there are no specifics in the denials. So what comes through this book is that he's a man without any self-awareness. He's devoid of any sense of humour. He's got no self-deprecation, feels no sympathy for anyone else, and that's pretty obvious. He's willing to badmouth even his niece, and implying that she was a complete wastrel, and he took her under his wing and things like that, and expressed sexual desire towards her. At least she was well into adulthood when he did it. So, I mean, nothing would shock me. He just can't go any lower. Couldn't be more underwhelmed by him. But it tells a bit more of the inside story. And again, this chimes with much of what was known. It's just yet another eyewitness telling us what was widely realized already. So Donald Trump's father was Fred Sr. Donald Trump's the fourth of 5 children. His eldest brother was Fred Jr. So Fred Jr. was crushed by their father. He was mocked, he was derided, he was belittled in public, he was subject to such horrific humiliation. Now, that wouldn't do anyone's budding psychology any good. When you're at a tender age, very vulnerable and very susceptible to these paternal slights. Trump Sr. believed that you should stamp on people, particularly gentle people, to seek out weak targets. And that's what Donald Trump does. He always hits the raw nerve, publicly ridiculing someone who's physically disabled, insulting women about their appearances, especially if they're d'une certain âge, making crass comments about menstruation, and on and on. So Trump seems to believe that reasonableness is weakness, and it comes out in this book. And he got the idea from his father that compassion is contemptible. So Fred Trump really thought that extreme avarice was sacrosanct, a bit like that speech in Wall Street, that 1987 film, I think it was, that greed, for the lack of a better word, is good, as Gordon Gekko said. So what's his name? Fred Trump Sr. appears to have all these Donald's vices in generous measure. Egotism, selfishness, and no ethical bottom line. So he'll take up cudgels for his cause, and Donald Trump has got all his father's negative behaviours in spades. So Fred Trump Sr., he became a multimillionaire who was completely bereft of morality and compassion by cheating, lying, stealing, just like Donald Trump. So the thing about Donald Trump is he comes across in this book as educationally subnormal, and really everything I've seen or heard about him confirms that. He can't read at an adult level, often can't cope with a teleprompter. That's why he riffs, ad-libs quite a lot, reads almost nothing, claiming to be there. One time I saw footage of him, can you read this document? I forgot my glasses. I've never ever seen him any footage of it or a photo of him ever wearing glasses. Have you? Even sunglasses, actually. Does he wear contacts? Not so far as I'm aware. If you knew you're going to have to read documents, you'd bring your glasses, right? A bit like when he's being asked about a Tom Wolfe novel, claiming that he couldn't hear through the earpiece one time. This is an interview over 20 years ago, even though he could clearly hear just fine and answered all the questions without any difficulty or hesitation, giving germane answers. I've never read a Tom Wolfe novel, right? So I'm not going to pretend that I have, like Trump, who could only describe it in the woolliest generalities, saying, oh, it's wonderful, beautiful book, great, yeah, wonderful. Like specifically what? What happens in it? Characters, plot development? No idea. What about use of language? Anyway, so it seems to me he's functionally illiterate, so he's got very little ability to take in information. And he can't process information. I suspect he has attention hyperactivity deficit disorder. You know, I've taught enough pupils over the years, and in many ways he's still infantile. You know, you see the emotional inconfidence, the raging. He wasn't always like that. Obviously going into second childhood as he's a septuagenarian. If you look at footage of him in the 90s or earlier, he had some decorum to him. He was sometimes quiet, he was placid, he was measured, he was composed. He could be on display mode, and now he's just lost all self-discipline. So I suspect he had undiagnosed learning difficulties, and when he would have left school about 1964, when these things were only just beginning to be recognised. So he appears to have a complete dearth of assessment capability, assessing evidence or statements. Is this true? Is it false? He can't evaluate these things. Partly true, partly false. How much can I trust this statement? You know, is it very likely to be true? Somewhat likely, unlikely? And how important is this information? Doesn't seem to be able to assess things in that kind of a way, to formulate an argument, to marshal his facts, things of that nature. So he seems to have a severe lack of critical thinking skills. Nobody's perfect on these things. You know, I have my educational deficits too. So can't process information, which is a major handicap in a president, and he's also, as I say, hampered by a full, what would I say, gamut of psychological disorders. Anyway, he's shown himself to be anti-pedagogical. Maybe he's very resentful at the teaching profession because he did so badly at school. There was that notorious Mount Rushmore tirade just about a week ago, claiming that children were taught lies by left-wing teachers, that universities are all Marxist madrasas. Now, there is a grain of truth in some of this, that yes, most professors are left-wing, and not that many of them are Marxists in the United States. And he's railing against teachers for telling the truth about American history, which would include the ugly side. Okay, every country's got hideous chapters to its history. Look at us in Ireland, or the British Isles as a whole, and they're bad people from my country, and they're bad people from other countries, and sometimes we've done foolish, unfair, even evil things to each other, to others. But for Trump, he simply can't accept that. But, although not giving specifics, so give me a lie. Tell me one actual lie. I mean, there might be some, but he didn't cite a single one. So he wants this narrow-minded, jingoistic, flag-waving sort of Fox News edition of American history, which would really stick in the craw, particularly of ethnic minority people, to really whitewash American history. Yes, pun intended, whitewash in both senses. And then so often, so-called patriotic history is a whited sepulchre. It's the kind of very distasteful things that this friend President Xi in China would go in for, as in just indoctrination in chauvinism, in mythologizing for hyper-nationalism. So would like, say, slavery to be downplayed as much as possible, aggression against Native Americans to be, like, say, written out of the script. Now, I'm not saying every white American was bad. No, some were good. I'm not saying that every Native American was good. No. But it is true that there are plenty of treaties made with Native Americans, and quite often those are broken by the US government. and quite a lot of Native Americans, indeed civilians, were killed by the US military, by other white Americans. And yeah, there were some Native Americans who did bad to white Americans and indeed to each other. And I don't eulogize about, say, pre-Columban America, saying that all was sweetness and light. No, they could have been bad to each other as well. There is a tendency, especially amongst left-wingers, to over-romanticize pre-colonial societies. Obviously, Trump would not like to confront the Jim Crow era. Some African Americans living in semi-servitude even to the 1960s, sharecroppers and so on, to the gross injustice with which there's scarcely been a reckoning to this day by many people. The Tulsa massacre, I was aware that there was racial violence in Tulsa. I hadn't realized just how one-sided it was until recently. To the ongoing exploitation of many people to this day with no minimum wage and so on. So Trump said every statement is a lie. That's a direct quotation. Every statement is a lie. Wow, what a sweeping lying statement that is from him. Some, maybe many lies could be told, but to say every statement in as a lie is surely overreaching himself. Saying they're taught to hate their country. Well, if you might love your country, you might want it to be better and to recognize it's not perfect. You might love someone, something, somewhere, despite its flaws. Instead of lying to yourself, I don't think that serves any useful purpose. And then want your countrymen to be treated fairly. So therefore, you've got to recognize injustice and try to resolve that. So what Trump wants is miseducation. White nationalist brainwashing would suit him just fine. And that's almost how it was when he was a schoolboy. And similarly, I've seen school books in the United Kingdom in the 1950s. It was almost like that in the UK. I remember a woman who was at school in those days said, I was brought up to think that England was the most magnificent and civilized country in the world and had never done a wrong thing ever, which is clearly a complete absurdity. Anyway, so Trump lacks the mental equipment for his job. You don't need to be a scholar to be president, and how different his niece is. So some of what I'm saying is obviously not coming out of her book. I realised trying to be president, being too academic could be bad for you. You mustn't come across as a smart aleck. You mustn't over-intellectualise. George Bush Sr. taking a swipe at what's his name, Michael Dukakis, saying, that foreign policy statement seems like it comes from Harvard Yard, to appeal to populism, to class envy, resentment, anti-intellectualism, despite Bush Sr. having been to Yale. Now, did he really get their merits? Maybe. Dukakis, okay, I mean, he wasn't poor. His father was a gynecologist, but he emigrated from Greece. But Dukakis certainly came across as brainy. Just optics play too much of a part. Did Dukakis lose just because he was short, just because of images of him going around in a tank to show he's tough on defense? Maybe. Even dreadful presidents like, say, Ronald Reagan, being re-elected with a 20 percentage point majority. Thumping win for him. Won all but 2 states against a far superior candidate, Walter Mondale. Anyway, so Trump, he seems to crave security, for himself, that he can be sure of his position, that he owns so much, that he's just the greatest. So that's why he feels so under threat all the time. That's why he's always lashing out. Stability, does he want that? Maybe if he owns everything, then he's got stability. But he's such a maelstrom of emotions himself, and that comes through in the book, and to be severely lacking self-worth, as Dr. Trump says of him. So anyone who forces him to face the truth is evil, he seems to think. You see how touchy he is, very vulnerable, must be plagued by self-doubts, which he always externalizes and then espouses hatred towards others, just expectorating the foulest insults towards people who ask some worthwhile questions of him. He can't take it. Extremely intolerant and thin-skinned. Remember Fox News used to rail against Obama, saying he was thin-skinned. Well, where are their philippics against Trump, who's far more thin-skinned? So Trump clearly lacks detachment, whereas his niece does not. He has no objectivity, and you need to soberly and rationally analyze things, weigh up our options in Iran, what should we do, what are the pros and cons each way, what are the likelihoods of success, and so on. There's none of that sort of thing. And John Bolton also corroborates this about the chaotic, what can I say, harlequinade that passes for decision-making in the Trump White House. So Trump's mindset is entirely self-serving, as comes across in Bolton's book too, as in, how will this affect my poll numbers? No, what's right for the United States, for our prosperity, our security, anything else. And he has a complete lack of empathy. treating people as utensils to be picked up, used, and discarded. So he seems to suffer some sort of inner pain, deep down recognise his worthlessness, and he's poisonous to himself. So Trump craves this incessant adulation, as his niece says. There's this constant self-praise, and he's such a whinge bag. He's got this victim mentality. It's very unfair to me. The media is very unfair to me. Oh, the Mueller probe is going to be very unfair to me. Always whining like that. Doesn't it come across like a toddler? And yet his side, the Republican Party, they're the macho men. They're really tough. They don't like the girly men, as Schwarzenegger said, and the Democrats, the softies who've got their victim mentality. Hey, some of the Democrats do have a victim complex. But why then do all these really hard men of the Republican Party support Trump, who's always being such a crybaby about people being unfair to him? Was life unfair to him when he was born like a wasp in New York to a multimillionaire family? Was it unfair to him with someone with his abysmal academic record that he won't release to this day, that he got into 2 of the top universities in the United States? Was life unfair to him, made billions of dollars? Was it unfair to him when he went bankrupt 4 times and still remained very rich? Was it unfair to him when he got to marry 3 very good-looking women? Was it unfair to him when he had 5 very healthy children? Was it unfair to him when he got to be president, despite being beaten by Hillary Clinton by 3 million votes? Was it unfair to him when he stayed out of jail for all his manifold crimes? I mean, I can't think of anyone who's been more privileged. It is staggering what he's got away with. He espoused this Fifth Avenue principle himself. He could shoot someone dead on broad daylight in Fifth Avenue and get off scot-free. He's got to clean away with so much, with just, fraud in plain sight, as in, the Trump University scam. So he's a con man, as Marco Rubio called him. And so many of his party recognized him for what he was in 2016, fallen strangely silent since. Anyway, so Trump's narcissism causes him to engage in all this destructive behavior, as his niece pointed out, and he's completely insincere. So he craves validation, and he needs it through naming things after himself. It's all me, me, me. Trump Organization, Trump Steaks, Trump Wine. He doesn't even drink wine, yet he vouches for it. Trump Airlines, Trump Towers, and then bragging about his heroism. But real brave men are not full of braggadocio, swaggering around, wants to be seen with the military, as though some of this will rub off on him. He's almost homoerotic, wanting to be seen with muscle men. So claiming he would have risen to the top of the military. Why didn't you do it then? So eager to avoid those bone spurs. By the way, if he has bone spurs, these are used to dodge the draft in Vietnam, they'd still be there. And I would love to. Well, that's one of the reasons he didn't release his medical records. Or Trump claiming he would have run into Parkland School when that guy was shooting the children. He would run in even if he had no weapon to confront him. Yeah, right. When has he ever shown one iota of moral courage, of physical courage? So it seems he can't add either. I mean, I'm no good at mathematics either, but he seems to be almost enumerate, which might explain all his business failures. So he has this grossly inflated notion of his own abilities, despite superabundant objective evidence that he's not very able at anything, but who's an indefatigable self-publicist. So narcissism, that Greek myth, Narcissus, who was so in love with his image, he was staring into the water so much that he fell in and drowned. So the purpose of this is to be a warning that self-adoration is destructive, and you shouldn't be too self-obsessed. And he's clearly a textbook example of how dangerous that can be. And he holds certain beliefs, and when there's belief disconfirmation, well, he doubles down. He's overcommitted to certain notions, such as his own unstoppable brilliance. He cannot acknowledge he's wrong. Some people make mistakes. I make mistakes. I mispronounce things here, and I tell you. So he's very, very touchy. So hypersensitivity wouldn't be thought to be a macho trait generally. But as his niece says, he's all about vengeance, that supposedly he mistakes cruelty for toughness, when real toughness would be showing some magnanimity, being merciful, being generous to the needy, to the vulnerable, to women, to children, to the disabled, not savaging them as he does. I mean, he's barbaric. And why are you constantly banging on about being so valiant? I can't remember which American politician said it. If you have to say you're a lady, you probably ain't. So he doth protest too much. So he's not open to new experiences. One of the reasons he doesn't learn things. New culture is quite xenophobic, despite being born to an immigrant mother, having immigrant grandparents on his father's side, not the remotest interest in Germany, even though ethnically he's 50% German. Can't speak of a word of a foreign language, so far as I know, despite having had 2 foreign wives. And his children, again, seem to show a complete lack of interest in the homelands of their mothers, as in the 2 who were born to that Czech one, Ivana, and the latest one, Baron. Well, I don't know, he's quite young. Does he have any interest in Slovenia, his mother's birthplace? I don't think so. Trump spent 1 night in Slovenia, precisely 1. So he's not open to new experiences, extremely narrow-minded, a sort of an American supremacist. And he obviously engages in ad hominem because he can't engage in issues, can't deal with substantive issues in politics. It's always, you're a liar, you're very unfair to me, you're mean, you're part of the failed establishment, rather try and see any flaws in their argument and attack their paradigm. Well, he can't do that when someone else presents a model for a different policy. Always saying he knows so much, that he could have risen to the top of the military, saying that his understanding of coronavirus was so phenomenal that it greatly impressed even professors of epidemiology and virology. Does it really? And none of them said so, strangely, when you know that singing his praises will only do your career a lot of good. I mean, I don't really know what virology and epidemiology are. I know they're branches of medicine to do with these sort of diseases, epidemics and viruses, but that's it. But Trump, obviously, despite having no background in science, is an expert, calling himself a genius when there's obviously ample evidence that he's far from that. So being hyper-confident and thinking that bluster and bombast can get him through, and it's got him a surprisingly long way. So he never apologizes, and someone with a whit of decency would own up to it. Yes, my mistake, I got it wrong. Like John F. Kennedy, one of the noblest things he ever did after the Bay of Pigs was to accept responsibility. There was a real leader, and to greet them when they were on the beach when they were released, the Bay of Pigs prisoners. As John F. Kennedy said, victory has 1,000 fathers, but defeat is an orphan. So he's too feeble, always lying, moving on to the next lie. Plenty of examples of his dishonesty in that book. So he's ultra aggressive, as his niece said. He's replete with spite, vitriol, vulgarity, cruelty, misanthropy. He's completely sardonic. Flagrant lying has become a way of life to him. It's almost his breathing rhythm, just bare-faced lying. He's clearly the most dishonest man in the world. He's not the most evil. There are others who've killed far more people. But honestly, compared to even Putin or Kim Jong-un, I don't think they lie as frequently as he does. So he's vicious. He bears a grudge. That's only when he's a man of his word, when he swears that you will not be forgiven, that he will exact revenge on you. So he appears to suffer from these deep-seated insecurities, this sense of worthlessness. So at least he's right on one thing. And that's why he has this insatiable desire for constant recognition and laudation. And he's received it because he's got his claque. So he never apologizes and never acknowledges that he's factually wrong, or his policies failed or anything like that, or that he's morally wrong. So if he takes a small mistake by his enemies, he'll obviously inflate that a lot more proportion. I'll say they're crooked Hillary. Okay, she has lied about things. Or the fake news media, if they've ever made a mistake about things, or whoever's unfair. Oh, well, you're married to a Democrat there, before you must be unfair. The idea of objectivity or even-handedness just doesn't even occur to him that such a thing could exist, that there could be a disinterested service of the public. No, because he can only ever act in consonance with personal gain, claiming the moral high ground. So he is a stranger to reason. I mean, not just being sane, but like rationality, no capability for ratiocination. So illogicality is a thread which runs through his discourse. At least he's consistent on that one. He's very acquisitive, always going on about money, as his niece said, and doesn't value people, doesn't value his family, as Dr. Trump pointed out. So he's obviously experiencing a cognitive declension right now, and that's why the disfluencies in his speech are ever more frequent and more severe. His train of thought is so often derailed. Anyway, I would remind him that high treason is still a death penalty offence in the United States, and he was to some extent working as an agent for Vladimir Putin. And claiming the 2016 vote was rigged. Well, why didn't you withdraw then? You can withdraw now if this one's rigged, as he's increasingly saying. because yet again, I mean, he thinks he's going to lose. Now it really does look like he's going to lose. Thank God. Now I know he's quite far behind at the polls, and yes, sometimes a lead can turn to dust, but I can't think of a time when this big a lead, this close to the election, didn't materialise. But the rules are always changing. It's not beyond the bounds of possibility that Trump will still pull it out of the bag. He wants to suppress the vote, and Republican states have taken millions of voters off the register, not just dead people, other people, claiming that they're bogus votes, that the foreigners have interfered, like the Chinese, to unseat him, despite the one, obviously, he knowingly assisted Russian interference, openly begged them to hack into Russia's emails, claimed it was a joke. I don't think he's ever cracked a joke in his life. So there we are, Donald Trump. I mean, obviously, I'd really like him to die of coronavirus. So please follow me on Twitter, on Instagram, on Facebook, and book online lessons of me in history and politics, English literature, English language, English as a foreign language, French and law, geography, religious studies, things like that, and get me to translate for you from French, Spanish, Italian, Romanian, German, and Russian. I'll be your tour guide in London. I help people edit theses, personal statements, things like that, dissertations, essays, and your CV, that's your resume. We'll help you with elocution and public speaking, interview preparation. Okay, toodaloo.